So this is called Cotard's delusion. So you go to your doctor, you say like, look, I think I'm dead. And then the other one is called Kapskar's delusion, and it's the delusion that a loved one, usually a spouse, has been replaced by a doppelganger.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So the interesting thing about those is that they don't seem to be lying, right? They don't seem to be like trying to trick the psychiatrist, but they also seem to fail to make the normally automatic inferences from the belief, right? So, for example, the people come and say, look, my spouse has been replaced by a doppelganger. They very often, not always, but they very often forget to ask the question, well, but where's my spouse?
Welcome back to If I'm Really Honest, where I seek truth without tribalism. Today, my guest is once again the widely cited and respected Dr. Jonathan Jong.
Dr. Jonathan Jong.
There's a paper by Jonathan Jong.
I'd also recommend this article by Jonathan Jong.
Today, we approach his perhaps greatest field of expertise, CSR, or Cognitive Science of Religion. I think of it as the psychology of why we believe what we believe. I mean, we think that we believe in things that are true because they're true. But if that's true, then why doesn't truth always just prevail and everybody believes the same thing? If you've got a simple answer to that, which requires looking at a single passage from whatever your favorite holy book is, you're probably not going to like this episode, and I really wish that you were open to it. Because he's like the person that smart people think is one of the smart people. But what do humans know compared to the Quran? I mean, the Book of Mormon. I mean, the King James Version of the Holy Bible. And to all the open-minded free thinkers, it is once again my unearned privilege to give you Dr. Jonathan Jong. So my first three questions were going to be,
Sorry.
what is religion, why is religion, and what is CSR?
Okay,
Lay the foundation of some of this stuff.
I'm going to start with the what is CSR thing, I think. So, social scientists and psychological scientists, and as a group, right? So if you think about psychologists, not like the therapy kind, like I mean the people who study human behavior kind. So psychologists, anthropologists, sociologists, to some extent political scientists and economists, we've kind of been interested in religion forever, right? Since the very beginning. So anthropology in its modern form is founded in the 1800s, right? Sociology, it's early 20th century. Psychology is a bit more controversial, I think. So we usually date modern psychology to Wilhelm Wundt's lab in Leipzig in the late 1800s. And then some people think that sort of Freud invents modern psychology, so that's early 1900s. Fine. We're talking about a field that goes from around the middle of the 18th century onwards, right? And if that's the birthday of social science and psychological science, then we have always been obsessed with religion. So Wundt has worked on religion. Freud obviously has worked on religion. E.B. Tyler, arguably the kind of parent figure of anthropology, has famous work on religion and also a famous definition of religion, which we'll get to. Emil Durkheim, again, credited as the founder of sociology, worked on religion, has a famous theory about religion. If there's going to be another parent of sociology, I guess is Max Weber, also worked on religion. So there's like the question of understanding religion as a phenomenon at various levels, whether social and cultural or psychological, individual, or somewhere in between, has been with us as a field, as a collection of fields since the very beginning of our fields. And the difference across the fields is kind of one of method more than anything else. And also of focus, right? So sociologists tend to study things at a social and cultural level. Psychologists tend to study things at an individual level. They somehow meet somewhere in between. Anthropologists are kind of in between, I guess. They go to communities and watch how individuals interact with other individuals within a community in a real life setting. And lots of questions get asked about religion. Right. So it's at one level, social scientists and psychological scientists, we describe what happens when people are behaving religiously, right? Or we look at patterns in people's religious and non-religious behavior. So, for example, we might ask questions about whether or not religious people are more I don't know, generous than non-religious people, or whether or not whether religious people are more prone to prejudice than non-religious people. These are all actual questions that people have asked, right? So that's one level of questioning, which is like, let's call it descriptive, right? We can provide a picture of what religion looks like in an individual's life, in a community's life, as it relates to other aspects of their lives. But another strand of questioning that has been with us since the 19th century has been this why question that I described earlier as a luxury, right? And it's the question, well, why are people religious, right? Where does religion come from? Where does religion come from in the life of an individual, for example, in their childhood? But also, where does religion come from in our species, right? As Homo sapiens, right? A particular kind of more or less hairless ape, right? It's not obvious that there should be religion, from an evolutionary perspective, right? The belief in invisible things, right? That are not very amenable to empirical verification, but which nevertheless engender quite costly behavior, right? Costly for the individual. So, for example, lots of religious traditions require religious adherents as individuals to make sacrifices of various kinds, right? And some of those sacrifices are material, like giving money away. Some of them are more straightforwardly physiological, like fasting. But some of the sacrifices that religious people are expected to make across quite a few different traditions is reproductive, right? There are in most religious traditions currently, which is not to say throughout time, there are castes which, of people within religious traditions who are expected to remain celibate forever. So I'm talking about monks and nuns, right? But that is evolutionarily perverse, right? For there to be an entire bunch of people who are not supposed to reproduce, it's totally evolutionarily perverse.
I think this is like one of the perhaps the most overlooked aspects of religion by atheists who complain about religion, how it's just an evolutionary thing. Like it wouldn't have survived if your story is true. There's no way that religion can survive.
Well, yeah, maybe, but that's the question, right? So I think it's not. I think faced with the cost of being religious, right? We have a real scientific question, which is, given how we understand evolutionary theory, right, and given what we see is true of religion, right, how do we put these things together, right? How is it that religion could have evolved given the cost? Now, prima facie, it seems like religion can't have evolved because, like, look at how costly it is, right? It's ridiculous. But of course, the best examples of evolutionary theory working is when it manages to explain seemingly unexplainable things, right? I mean,
and this is what I'm saying. Like the cost, the fact that the cost is so high means we have to assume that it has some great benefit, because the cost
or is a byproduct of something that's very, very important.
Sure. Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is this? Yes. The same thing in my mind. But yes. Like this has to be sticking around for
some reason,
for some benefit.
Yeah. There has to be some cost, right? So this is where CSR comes in, right? So this is where the cognitive science of religion comes in. These days, we tend to like evolutionary and cognitive science of religion because we like the evolutionary parts. So where we come in is to ask precisely that question. Is to go, okay, we can see, because our founders, if you like, so the cognitive science of religion kind of starts in the 90s, right? And there's a bunch of anthropologists and some philosophers who decide that, wait a second, there are these people in psychology doing something called cognitive science, and we think that might be interesting and important for how we understand religion. So that's how it begins. Anyway, because the kind of founding fathers and mothers of the field were anthropologists who really understood religion descriptively, I think they could see the problem. They could see that there's a kind of evolutionary challenge here, right, that needs to be answered if we're going to be kind of like, thoroughgoing Darwinians. And so that's where they begin thinking about a bunch of different theories, right? So there are two dominant theories, which is not to say that they're mutually contradictory. I just mean that they're two kind of like, there were two intellectual projects. One is to think about, let's assume that we're not going to find any direct benefit of religion to either the individual or the group, right? Like, what would have to be true if we assume that, right? So what will have to be true is that religion will have to be the byproduct of some really important cognitive processes that are important for other reasons, right? And so that was one route that people took, which was, okay, let's say that religion is a byproduct of the way in which our minds evolved to be social, right? And the social understanding is a very important part of human, like, psychological evolution, and it turns out that one of the byproducts of the way in which human beings are social just happens to produce the belief in gods, right? That's one route. Fine.
I have a hard time getting there emotionally. Can you convince me of that quickly, or no?
Maybe we'll get there. Maybe. Then the other route is to go, okay, like, let's relax the assumption that we're not going to find any direct benefit of religion, right? So we can either relax the assumption by saying, okay, let's keep the assumption that there'll be no direct benefit to the individual, right? But that collectively, like, having religion in a group is somehow beneficial for the group, right? And then that's how we get to the evolution of religion, by thinking not at the kind of gene-centric individual level, but at the kind of, like, right, group level.
Sure. Yeah.
Right.
Meme-centric, maybe.
And yeah, maybe, right? And so that's one route. And then the other way is to relax even the individual criterion. You say, okay, like, what if we speculate about what possible benefits religion could have had for individuals, right? Okay, so that's kind of how the cognitive science of religion proceeded, right, from the 90s, which is some people made the assumption that there'll be no individual level benefits or even group level benefits evolutionarily, and so the quest was for how to construct a byproduct theory, and the other people were a bit more relaxed and went, okay, maybe there are group level effects, and then some people were even more relaxed and were like, maybe there are even individual level effects. Okay, and there were a bunch of theories, and and then people decided to collect data. We run experiments, we make observations, and the field has kind of progressed since then. Okay,
maybe it's my ignorance. It seems intuitive that individual benefits are group benefits as far as the survival of the species. Like, in a lot of cases, not all, but like your group needs the individual to do a thing. So like sacrifice and so on.
Yeah,
sacrificing your life in or the monk and whatever it is that, like, we need this role to be played. So
yeah, that's right. So that's really good. The self-sacrificing is a really good example, right? So there are some things that are bad for the individual, which are nevertheless good for the group in a way that it is good for the group for some individuals like that to exist.
So my greatest individual need is that my genes get passed into the future.
Right.
So that if I need my children to, for example, eat my body in order to carry on, that is beneficial to me. That is my own.
Yeah, that's right.
As far as my goals are concerned.
So there's an example where what looks like a thing that's bad for the individual is actually good for the individual from a gene-centric level, right? So there are evolutionary theorists who think that that there are some traits that only benefit the group to the detriment of the individual and their genes, right? So that natural selection acts not only at the level of the individual and their genes, but even at the level of the group. So the classic example is this, right? So this is not about the tension between individuals and groups. This is just about groups for now, right? So the classic example is, look, let's say you have a bunch of different species, right? And some species live in caves, right? And some species live, like, out in the open ocean, right? And then, like, a meteorite hits the earth, and then as it happens, it lands in the water, right? And then all the sea creatures die, but the cave dwellers are somehow fine. Okay, so one of the analytical questions that evolutionary theorists ask is, well, is cave dwelling a trait of the individual, or is it the trait of the group? Right. So that's controversial, right? Because like it's obviously true that the species lives in the cave, but what that means is every individual of the species lives in the cave, right? So okay, fine. That's a fuzzy example. Okay, let's move slightly sideways. Let's think about another kind of trait. Okay, let's say that there are some species where the males are bigger than the females, right? And other species, the females are larger than the males, and then in like a third group of species, the males and females are the similar size. Okay. And now I need to think of like a different selective scenario. Okay, like here's a silly one. Like some space aliens come, right? And they wipe out they think it's freaky that some males and females are different in size, so they wipe out all the sexually dimorphic species. They don't like it when the male is bigger, they don't like it when the female is bigger, so they kill them all. And the only ones that survive, the only species that survive are the ones where the males and females are the same size. And then the aliens fuck off, right? So okay, so there a kind of selection has happened, right? But it's not selection on the basis of any individual trait, okay, right? Much like the cave dweller, right?
Well, it's not sexual selection.
No, yeah. Here is just a bunch of aliens who decide to like artificially select two groups out, right?
Right.
But okay, so here are the two important facts, right? The first important fact is that the selection is not done on the basis of any individual trait. It is done on the basis of a trait of a whole species, which is because sexual dimorphism is not the trait of any individual, right? It's a fact about the whole species, right? And this is importantly true. This is importantly different from the cave dwelling example, because in the cave dwelling example, you can reduce the group level trait to the individual level, right? So to say that a whole species lives in a cave is reducible to saying that every individual of the species lives in the cave, right? But this is not true for sexual dimorphism, right? To say that a species is sexually dimorphic or not sexually dimorphic is not to say that any given individual in the species is sexually dimorphic, because the member of the species has to be male or female, right? So the fact that males are bigger than females is not a fact of any individual. It is only a fact at a group level. It is a group level fact, right? So if you can imagine a scenario in which selection occurs on group level facts that are not individual level facts, then the argument goes, then group level selection is real, right? Or at least it's possible, right? And what that means is that there might be some facts about groups that are selected for to the detriment of some individuals, because these are decouplable, right? The moment you can decouple group level traits and individual level traits, you get the possibility of selecting for a group level trait that is bad for some individuals and their genes. So let's say the scenario is that it is good for some reason for groups to have religious people. Some religious people. They don't all have to be religious, some of them have to be religious, right? So maybe what's happening is that groups of humans, right, who have like self-sacrificing like castes of nuns and monks who don't reproduce and also throw themselves into volcanoes, like before they are of reproductive age, maybe that somehow boosts the morale of armies, right, in such a way that enables them and motivates them to conquer other lands and reproduce rapidly with conspecifics, right? So there's an example where it's very good for the group that there are these monks and nuns that never reproduce and throw themselves into volcanoes, right? But it's clearly bad for the monks and nuns.
Can I ask, is this similar to the question of like, why are there gays and psychopaths that persist, or is that not?
So I have a friend Jesse Bering.
Go ahead.
No.
I was just going to explain the question more, but I feel like you. Those all three sound similar to me. Like, why do we have monks? Why do we have gays? Why do we have psychopaths? All of those are detrimental to
the individual
themselves, and it doesn't seem like they necessarily provide a benefit to the group on first blush.
Yeah,
I
that's
don't know,
right.
maybe not that same
No,
question.
I think that's right. So, and you can multiply this example, right? So, so there are some evolutionary theories about schizophrenia, about homosexuality, about psychopaths, which are structurally similar. And I think there are theories about like why humans live for so long because we need grandmothers or something like that, right? Or like which is not
Right.
not
Yeah,
necessarily good for
heard
the
that.
grandmothers, but are good for this, right, for the species. Something. Yeah. So it's that kind of story, right? That so the group selection is like that kind of story. Now, I mean, whether or not any of these stories are true, I have no idea. Right? But the point is that people began constructing these kinds of theories, right? And so that's the kind of evolutionary end of the field, evolutionary cognitive science of religion. The cognitive end is where we try to understand how sort of humans perceive the world and process information, right? Which is the task of cognitive scientists and has been since, I guess, the 50s. And what that might tell us about how human beings think about gods and about souls and the afterlife and morality or whatever, right? And this use of like basic cognitive psychology to understand religion um, really came into his own more in the kind of byproduct end of the field, right? So the kind of group selectionists and the individual level selectionists who were straightforward Darwinians, who thought that they could find some kind of evolutionary benefit either to the group or to the individual of religion, even though it looks very costly on the face of it, they're in that sense less interested in the kind of basic cognitive science, right? The real interest in the cognitive science comes from the people who want to assume let's assume no benefits, right? So how like what is it that makes religion almost inevitable anyway, given the way that the mind works, right? Given the way that human beings process information. There in the early days there were two dominant theories about this, which are again related to one another. The first is about production of religious ideas, and the second is about maintenance and transmission of religious ideas, right? So on the production end, the theory is a very old one in some ways, which rests on the idea that human beings, kind of like our brain evolution is very much driven socially, right? That the kind of success of our species has a lot to do with our ability to make sense of one another's beliefs and feelings, thoughts and feelings, right? So when human beings communicate with one another, we don't just do so directly, right? We don't just text each other, even though it sometimes feels like that these days. But the ability to make assumptions about how you're feeling based on your facial features, the assumptions about what you want based on the way you behave, all these inferences that we make based on very ephemeral and frankly weak evidence, right?
Yeah, right.
Your facial features are very ephemeral, very weak evidence, right? But we leap to conclusions. Like I look at you and I think you're happy, and I behave accordingly. So we it seems like we evolve these intuitions about how to read one another, right? We have very kind of active social imaginations, right? So the idea is that that's very important for our species. That we develop this tendency to think psychologically about other human beings, under very kind of fuzzy evidence, right? So some people think that one byproduct of that is that we not only jump to conclusions about the contents of people's minds, but we also jump to conclusions about the existence of minds, right? So I intuitively assume that you have a mind, right? That you're not a philosophical zombie, right? And that's fine. But as it turns out, I make the same assumptions about like Siri and the vending machine in the hallway, and like we anthropomorphize things in a psychological direction, right? So it's not that we think that they look like humans, but we kind of attribute mentality to inanimate objects, right? I mean, the classic example is pets, right? There is no real sense probably in which your parrot loves you, right? When your parent
It's
says,
heartbreaking, but yeah, maybe.
like when your parent says she loves you, it's like what she means is give me a cracker,
Right.
right?
Well, yes, of course. Maybe that's what we mean too, but
Yeah, maybe that's what,
I
indeed.
prefer to live as if both of them mean it.
Absolutely.
Yes.
But you can see where this is going, right? Like, so we attribute mental states to humans. That seems fine. We attribute mental states to our dogs. Maybe that's all right. We attribute mental states to our goldfish. That's a bit more tenuous. We attribute mental states to our cell phones, right? And that seems like an anthropomorphic error, right? So then the cognitive scientists say, well, as it turns out, we just kind of also attribute animacy and intelligence and psychology to like the world, right? Or to invisible agents, right? And that, as it were, is the kind of story that people in my field want to tell about, like how gods get invented, not like the idea of gods, right? And then two things need to happen, right? Once you have like the possibility that, oh, maybe they're invisible things, right? Persons without bodies, right? Two things need to happen. One is that the idea has to be useful, right? It has to fulfill some function. It could be a psychological function, like an emotional one, right? So maybe the belief, the thought, the intuition that that there is a person who happens to be my grandma who is now dead, but the person still exists. Maybe the usefulness of that is emotional, right? Or maybe it's useful in explanatory terms, right? It's like, look, we can easily imagine, bodiless minds, and that's why we have lightning or something, or
Yeah,
whatever.
right, sure.
Right, fine.
Okay.
Or maybe it's useful. These ideas are useful as a means of shaping behavior, right? Well, like you got to behave because grandma is watching. So, don't do naughty things because grandma doesn't like that. And I know she's dead, but she's watching. And then you go from grandma to God, right? Basically. So people then have to think about, okay, like what once you get a hyperactive kind of, like mentation device, agency detector, call it what you like, right? A hyperactive theory of mind. The minds that we invent, right, then have to be useful. That's one thing.
Can I ask other clarified question there?
Yeah.
So does that bin also hold terror management and chaos reduction? Are
Sure.
those also in that same? Okay.
Yeah. So right. So one version of the usefulness is is maybe right. Like if I can imagine that that there are. It seems easy to imagine that there are people that don't have bodies, right? That their minds are still active, and that means that I'm not sad about grandma. But that also means that I don't have to be sad about myself, because one day I too will be, right, a mind without body, right? So that's the kind of usefulness part, right?
Right. Well, I'm thinking like more immediate, even like if there is a Thor that is angry, and that's why this lightning struck and my crops were destroyed. Like I can't handle the reality that maybe that was random, and so I would rather it be for a reason. And now I can sacrifice to this and feel some control, even though I have none. To reduce the chaos.
So that's a nice intersection between a kind of emotional need, right? Like an emotional need to feel a sense of control, and a kind of more, I guess, like intellectual sort of explanatory need to be able to account for the world, right? And I think those two, that example has those two things meeting nicely. Which a CSR person would say, well, that explains why there are so many crop deities, right, and so many kind of weather related deities.
Sure, yeah. Right.
Fine. And then I think so. The other aspect is that cognitive scientists think there's something interesting about gods, like cognitively, right? So, and what they think is that all gods are objects that fit in like a basic category of cognition, right? I'll get to what that is in a moment. But which kind of violates one of the assumptions of that category. Okay, right. So what does that mean? The idea is that that we're born like with some knowledge, right? Like some expectations about the world, right? So famously, newborn babies respond differently to things that look like faces than they do to things that don't look like faces, right? For example, very small children seem like surprised when they observe what look like basic violations of physics, of like Newtonian physics, right? So if they like see a ball that goes like that and then stops in midair and falls down, they seem surprised. Like their pupils dilate and they stare at it for a little while. They think it's a bit weird. Like, and they didn't learn that, right? Like they seem to kind of be born knowing that that's not how balls work. That's not how physical objects travel through space.
So help me then, because like object permanence is not a thing that we're born with, but like seems to develop at a certain point. Those kinds of things get triggered. So, like those seem like areas of the brain as opposed to like metaphysical interactions with the assumptions or something like that.
So the controversy here is the difference between development and learning, right? So
yeah, okay.
It seems like some of these traits, like object permanence, happen like earlier than some people say we should expect, if what they're doing is learning by experience, right? So if it's true that babies at several weeks and months old like seem surprised at violations of object permanence, then arguably they haven't had enough experience of the world to learn that it's not possible for two objects to occupy the same physical space, right? And yet they seem surprised by this. And so what we would say is, yes, it's true that they weren't surprised at age 0, and they were surprised at 4 months. But at age 0, they were basically blind. So like that, that's not a fair test, right? But you're in the right ballpark in terms of the literature, right? So the literature in developmental psychology, which came out in the 70s and 80s, seemed to suggest that we're born with certain like fundamental expectations about the world, right? And so for example, we might have expectations about physical objects, like inanimate physical objects, and then we might have expectations about animate objects, about persons and animals or something like this, right? And so there's been like a cottage industry in developmental psychology in trying to figure out what these deep intuitions are, right? What the basic categories are. What sorts of things do very small children seem to have intuitions and expectations about, right? And of course, these all develop at different stages, right? So object permanence seems to happen early. Theory of mind seems to happen a little bit after that. Intuitive physics happens very early. Intuitive biology seems to kick in at quite a young age.
Like, what's that?
So intuitive biology is like kids seem surprised when they discover that the babies of animals look very different from the parent. Right? There's an expectation that the babies should look like their parents, for example.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you can branch out intuitive biology into slightly more sophisticated reasoning. Like there's an expectation that trees are not animate, right? So if you see an object and you categorize it as a tree, then the expectation is it's not animate, right?
Right.
And then if the expectation, if the category that gets triggered is animal, then you expect that it is animate or something like this. So
Sure.
there's a big developmental industry of working out and mapping out and like drawing a chronology of development of different kinds of intuitions and the categories associated with those intuitions. So CSR people build on that work and go, okay, look, the developmental psychologists tell us that children, and then subsequently adults, perceive the world through categories. We see an object, we automatically categorize it as something, and then those categories generate expectations. And some of these categories are ontologically primitive, right? So they're developmentally primitive, rather. So they happen very, very early in development, right? Some of them are learned in a kind of more straightforward kind of sense, and some are in between, right? But it doesn't really, the difference doesn't really matter so much, right? The point is that we perceive the world through categories, and the categories generate expectations. And something happens when the reality matches the expectation, and then something else and arguably more interesting happens when they violate the expectations. So in the 90s and early 2000s, there was a dominant theory in CSR that said, look, here's the thing about gods. Most of them fall into the category persons, but they violate some, and importantly, very few expectations about persons. So, for example, we expect persons to have bodies, but most gods don't have bodies. And that single violation makes them very interesting. So it makes them not only useful in the way we've described earlier, but it makes them engaging cognitively in such a way that we want to talk about them, right? They're unusual enough that we want to talk about them. Now, importantly for the CSR people, you can't have a god who violates so many intuitions that they're hard to talk about.
Okay, like what?
Right. So for example, you can have like a talking tree, right? And you might even have a talking and walking tree, but as it turns out, that's much more rare than just a talking tree. Right?
Yeah, right.
So having
Okay.
2 violations is more uncommon than having 1 violation. Now, if you have a talking and walking tree that is also invisible, that seems like that's too many violations. Like there are very few, if any, beliefs in talking, walking, invisible trees. Right. So basically the more violations you stack on, the less probable the thing is to be passed on.
But it's more probable as long as you just don't pick tree. You pick something that can talk and walk, and then you only have the violation of invisible.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. So it's like, yeah, if it is a person, for example, then the talking and walking comes free, right? Then the violation is invisibility. And also this also helped people think about like maximally counterintuitive gods, right? So arguably, like the god of classical theism is extremely counterintuitive, right? So here's a god who is kind of a person, although classical theists really don't like talking about God as a person. No body, fine, that seems alright. But also, somehow, unlike all other persons we've encountered, like omniscient and also omnipotent and also omnipresent, and now there seem to be lots of properties that violate intuitions about persons, because persons are usually not omniscient and persons are usually not omnipotent, and persons are definitely not omnipresent. I mean, that doesn't make any, that's crazy. And so what a CSR person says is, okay, look, this God is very common, right? The omni God is, Muslims, Christians, Jews claim to believe in the omni God, right? Classical Greek philosophers claim to believe in the omni God. Arguably, Baha'i people do. Arguably, philosophical Hindus do, etc. Right? But it turns out that if you run experiments on people who claim to be Christians, Hindus, and Jews, they say they believe in the omni God, but they behave as if they don't.
Okay, in what way?
So the series of experiments that was very famous in the 90s was that this guy Justin Barrett and his colleagues got people to read like short stories in which God was a character, and so they'll tell a story about God. So here's an example, right? So once upon a time, right, this boy needs help, is drowning, so God helps the boy. Also, I don't know, this old man trips into a well, and God helps the old man. Isn't that great? End of story. And then he asks people to remember the story, right, later on, to recall the story. So crucially, for the story I just told, the story never says that God does one thing first and then does another thing. But what people remember is that God does one thing first and then another thing, as if God couldn't do 2 things at the same time. Or, there's a story, I think there's one example where like God is answering a prayer or listening to a prayer, and then like this really noisy bird outside or something like that, right? And then you try to capture people's intuitions about whether or not like God can hear the prayer, right? And then like, and if they're not careful, like when people are not careful, they begin to think that, oh, like, yeah, like I should probably say the prayer again because God couldn't hear because of the nightingale or something like this.
Right.
So we fall into these like little mistakes, right? These so the term is theologically incorrect intuitions, right? So the cognitive scientist says, look, it's true that the omni God of like philosophical theism is officially the God that all these people believe in, but in everyday life, that's just too many intuitive violations, and so we anthropomorphize God, right? We make God into something a bit more intuitive, a bit more like like us. So they take that as a kind of evidence that there's something going on here with like minimal levels of expectation violation.
Is that mostly when he's interacting with me? Because like I trust that he's taking care of all the other people in all of the other wells, or he's answering all of the other prayers at the same time.
Yeah.
But like when he's interacting with me, then I need him to be a little bit more like me.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that probably is true, but I think the difference here that they're trying to draw is between what sometimes people call hot and cold cognition. So when we're thinking abstractly, which we almost always do when we think about other people in other places, right? Then it's very easy for us to say things like, yeah, like God answers prayers everywhere simultaneously. That's fine. That doesn't seem difficult in any way. It doesn't seem counterintuitive. But when you're thinking live about a specific phenomenon, whether or not it applies to yourself, it seems that we find our abstract commitments a bit more difficult to deploy, right? In a kind of in a hot situation, live situation. It's a bit like whether or not we hold the beliefs that we hold under like cognitive pressure. And it turns out that under cognitive pressure, it is harder to hold on to this kind of like philosophically like robust kind of doctrine, right? Which is interesting to me as a theologian, and as a priest, because I think it makes you realize that, I said earlier, the nice thing about saying we believe, right, is that sometimes we don't believe, and then it's okay because there's a kind of collective that we can temporarily rely on, right? But I think that the reality of not always believing the thing that we think we ought to believe, I mean, that just is the lived reality of being a human being. Especially if these people are right, especially if cognitive scientists are right, that we find it easier to hold the beliefs, whatever that means, when thinking cold, when thinking in abstract terms, than when we're thinking live, right? And at a descriptive level, the inconstancy of our believing, I think, like, is a kind of important lesson to me, like as a person of faith, but also kind of as a religious leader, right? Because it means that I shouldn't expect of myself, nor should I expect of other people, a kind of like purity of theological orthodoxy at all times, right? That just as there's a cliche that St. Paul is not a systematic theologian, just as St. Paul is not a systematic theologian, like, even systematic theologians are not systematic theologians all the time. But that's very important. I think like it brings in the kind of human into how it is to exist as a person of faith, as a believer.
And that is like putting the cognitive science aside, like just as a Christian, that is the mystery of God. Like some things just don't, like I don't need to be able to understand all of it, because like it's in order for me to have a relationship with God, I have to accept that I don't have a relationship with his fullness. Like he's, I'm not able to grasp all of it. And so it feels like that would line up with the theory that all of the religion is true as well.
Yeah. And for the classical theists, right, including the classical theists in the Christian tradition, it is not just an acknowledgement of our humble estate, of our, I don't know, like cognitive lameness, or the byproduct of our sinfulness, or something. Like the mystery of God is not about like a deficiency in us. The claim that classical theists have always made is that there's something inherently ineffable about God. That it's not like an epistemic problem. It's not just that if we were cleverer we would get it, right? It is that there's something uniquely ineffable, like baffling about God, right? And it like and this is about the kind of like the otherness of God, right? The way in which God is categorically not a creature, not like any creature, and so the ability to understand God, to relate to God in God's fullness, is not like a failure on our part, cognitively, morally, or otherwise, but is an acknowledgement that there is a chasm of a difference, right? A kind of qualitative difference between what it means to be divine and what it means to be a creature. And so there's something appropriate about not being able. There's therefore something appropriate about not being able to hold all these ideas in our head, right, consistently, right? It's not just because we're a bit stupid, which I'm sure we are, but it's apt. It's apt to the essence of God that God is incomprehensible.
So then help me get back to cognitive science and the views, the research that you've been most interested in, and the views that seem most compelling to you.
I came into this in like the sort of early 2010s, right? Roughly. By this point, the field was already sort of, 15 years old, something like this, right? Maybe a bit more than that. And there had already been a bunch of these theories that I've been describing, and people have been working on them and collecting data, and some of the data wasn't any good, some of it was all right. So, and people are still kind of arguing about, which is the most promising route to go. Should we be byproduct theory? Should we be adaptationists, right? And think about whether or not there are any kind of direct or indirect benefits to either the individual or to the group when there are religious people around. So all that stuff is happening, right? And so I find myself mostly interested in whether or not there are any like psychological emotional benefits of religion that might make it worth it for religious people, right? That kind of motivates them to do so. And naively, as a graduate student, I thought, well, like let's just list them, right? Let's list possibilities, and then we'll run like 3 experiments on all of them, and then I'll have like 40 experiments by the end of my PhD, and it's great, right? And of course, like I never get past the first thing on my list.
Sure, right.
So I have like the fear of death, I have like the fear of loneliness, I have like a belief in a just world, or like a desire to believe in a just world. Or I have like people want to account for the universe and find meaning. Like I have a whole bunch of things that I think, what are the things that humans want, and like is there some way in which religion kind of gives it to them, which is the thing that makes it attractive, right, to people. Like a whole list of these things.
Right.
And I thought, right, okay, fine, let's start with death, because I heard these great lectures and read these great papers and books on terror management theory, which is the thing you mentioned. Now, terror management theory is a crazy theory. It's so crazy that I found it completely irresistible. Right. So
tell me what it actually means, because I'm sure that my view of it is not what it actually means. What does terror management theory mean?
Tragically, I think your view of it probably is accurate, because like it's a very simple idea, right? So the basic idea is that human beings know that we're going to die, right? We're aware of our mortality, and it fills us with terror, and we have found, as a species, as a culture, as individuals, we have found ways to ameliorate our terror of death, right? And we have done a very good job at this, right? We are so good at ameliorating our terror of death that we don't experience it in our everyday lives.
So then married to that, in my mind, is also hope, because those are they feel to me like the opposites.
So not necessarily for terror management theory, right? So for terror management theory, there are 2 ways to get rid of our fear of death, right? One way is the Hopi way, right? Is to like, okay, like maybe there's a way to achieve immortality, right? Like we could take pills and exercise and like avoid butter and margarine or other, whatever, right? Fatty foods, right? So like there's the kind of like healthy, like technological method of achieving literal immortality, or we could like believe in an afterlife, right? That's also helpful, right? So that's the Hopi thing, in both secular and religious directions. But actually, for most of the research attention done by terror management theory researchers has not had anything to do with that, right? Instead, they're interested in what they call sort of symbolic immortality, right? Which has nothing to do with actually living forever yourself, right? Whether or not in your body or elsewhere. So we'll get to symbolic immortality, but which some people might call distraction, right? So instead of trying to figure out how we can live forever, what we do to ameliorate our death anxiety is to distract ourselves to not really think about it or worry about it, right? So the theory goes, which is why we don't spend all our time like in existential terror at every moment of the day, right? We have found ways to distract ourselves sufficiently that we don't experience the terror of death. But without all these things that we do, we would feel the terror of death, right? So that's the theory. Okay. And one way to summarize the theory from another angle, and this is where it becomes kind of like absurdly and like deliciously compelling, I think, is to say that basically the fear of death is the primary motivator for all human activity and endeavor. That everything we do and seek to accomplish is in the service of keeping our terror of death at bay.
Yeah, I've heard that claimed before. It never quite emotionally resonated.
Yeah, it sounds crazy.
Okay.
Right? It sounds crazy in the way that every theory that says that everything is about one thing sounds crazy.
Right. Yes. Thank you.
You know, it's like, oh yeah, the everything is made of air. Okay, you know, that sounds crazy too. This is ancient Greek stuff, right? So any like monocausal theory of anything, it just sounds absurd to most like normal people. But it was so bold that I thought this is very cool. Right? Like I don't believe it, right? I think I don't really know. I didn't get into it because I believe it, right? I got into it because I thought like this is such like it's such a radical and like this guy had gumption, you know, like he had chutzpah, right? Like this is it's a big theory. So like I thought this is great. Let's do fear of death. Let's do some terror management style research on the fear of death and religion. So basically, I collected a bunch of data. I collected some correlational data, trying to measure the fear of death and trying to measure religious beliefs and seeing how they correlated. And I did that in various countries. So that was one line of research. And then I also ran some experiments in the style of terror management theory, in which you get people to think about death and then you kind of see what happens. So in my case, I got people to think about death and then I asked them about their religious beliefs. It was quite simple, right? So there's nothing kind of sophisticated about any of this. It's all very basic stuff. And so that was very interesting. And the findings, I don't know how interesting they were, but it was interesting to me. The process of trying to figure out what motivates people to believe, like that was very interesting to me. And whether or not religious beliefs like were driven by some kind of emotional need. So I started with the fear of death stuff, and then I moved on to looking at whether or not having had a traumatic experience in your past makes you more likely to be religious, right? So I did stuff like that, and so the theme was this, like what are the emotional roots, right, of our religious beliefs, and so I did that for a long time, and I thought it was very interesting. And then I began as part of that work, I had to like measure stuff, right? And in particular, I had to measure beliefs, right? And then I thought, well,
like strength of beliefs?
Yeah, well, but that's the question, right? Like, what does that mean, right?
Right.
Like, is belief a binary, right? Where you believe or not believe, right? Is strength like a dimension of belief, right? So that like, and what is strength anyway, right? So as soon as I tried to measure belief, all these questions arose, like that, like what does it mean to measure belief? And then of course that leads to the question, but like wait a sec, like what is a belief, right? And so more recently, that's been the question that's occupied quite a lot of my time and attention, which is like what does it mean to believe anything, right? And so the English word believe is used for everything from I believe there's milk in the fridge to I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, and I believe in anthropogenic climate change, as we have described earlier. But are those beliefs the same kind of thing psychologically, right? Are they represented the same way in the mind? Right? Do they activate the same areas of the brain? Whatever, right? Like however you put this, like we have the same English word that we use for all these contexts, but it's at least possible that these beliefs are structurally, cognitively different from one another, so that they might deserve at least qualification, that we should call them slightly different things because they behave in different ways.
And they feel emotionally different.
Well, and indeed.
Even with any of the research, like I know that my belief in my kids is different than my belief with the milk in the fridge. Like I don't care where you find it in my brain. I know experientially. That they're different things.
And then there are things that everyone knows, like by observation, right? Which is that the belief that there's milk in the fridge is easily empirically verifiable and falsifiable in such a way that if you go to your fridge now and you open the door and you see that there's milk in there, you cannot choose to disbelieve that there's milk in the fridge, right? Your senses just forbid you from doing so. But the belief that God loves you, right? That seems at least a little bit more amenable to volition, right? They seem to be things that you can do to cultivate that belief, right? So and that's very different from the milk example. So there's something interesting going on in terms of process about how you establish and strengthen beliefs. Some of them seem totally beholden to empirical evidence, and others seem much more labile and flexible. And so the question is, well, should we still call them beliefs, right? And then that's just in our everyday lives, right? So if you think about slightly more esoteric examples, like people with clinical delusions, right? Who say...
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
I was about to ask.
Yeah.
Right, because this is the same thing in their world, right? Like for a John Nash, whose best friend doesn't exist, but experientially does,
right,
and is empirically verifiable through his senses.
Through his senses, that's right.
So that's the milk in the fridge.
Yeah,
right. Yes.
And also there's some people who so not like John Nash, so some people who present very specific delusions, right? So there are two very famous specific delusions. One of them is the delusion that you are dead. So this is called Cotard's delusion. So you go to your doctor, you say like, look, I think I'm dead. Right. And then the other one is called Kapskar's delusion, and it's the delusion that a loved one, usually a spouse, has been replaced by a doppelganger.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so the interesting thing about those is that they don't seem to be lying, right? They don't seem to be like trying to trick the psychiatrist. But they also seem to fail to make the normally automatic inferences from the belief. Right? So for example, the people who come and say, look, my spouse has been replaced by a doppelganger, they very often, not always, but they very often forget to ask the question, well, but where's my spouse? Right? Like, this person is an alien, but they don't then automatically ask the question, where's my spouse? Which is what normal people would do. Right? So the question there for the cognitive scientist and the philosopher asking questions about the nature of belief is, okay, is what's happening in the delusion case that the person has a genuine belief that their spouse has been replaced by a doppelganger, but they have a failure of inference, right? So it's a failure of rationality, right? Or is it that actually they don't have the belief, right? It's not, whatever that is that they're reporting, it's not really a belief. Right, it's something else that's disguised as a belief.
Right. Well, yes, it was because what is intuitive to me is that they have a emotional disconnection from that thing.
Something
and
like
emotional is doing a lot of work there,
right.
but they fail to have a coherent narrative about it. And so this thing over here is the closest thing
right.
they can approximate to the experience that they have of being disconnected from this.
Right.
Thing.
So that's one possibility, right? That what's really happening is that there's an emotion thing going on, and there's like a post hoc rationalization. So they don't really believe it, but they feel like they have to make sense of feelings. So that's possible. And then the other possibility, which some people have come up with, is a bit more abstract, which is that actually what's happening here is that the experience is one of imagination, right? But it's being tagged the wrong way. So it's imagination which is being tagged metacognitively as belief. So we are mistaking our own cognitions. Right. So you can think of a more mundane example. So for example, sometimes you wake up in the morning, right? And you have a memory. Right? And it turns out it's not a memory, it was a dream, right? So what you've done there is you have mistakenly tagged a dream as a memory, right? So if that's possible, then it might be possible to tag mistakenly an act of imagination as an act of belief.
Is this similar to like the Truman effect thing where like you start thinking, what would it be like if I was if everything was fake, and you think it so deeply that now you can't get out of your imagination or something like that?
Yeah. So is this a real phenomenon, or is this just because of the Truman Show?
I'm sure that's not the name of it, but I feel like after the Truman Show, I heard about some increase in number of cases of people reporting, to their psychiatrist or whatever, that they were sure that it was not just their spouse, that their whole world was in on it.
Yeah, for sure, right? And you can see that phenomenon in, again, slightly less esoteric terms in lots of other things where people who inhabit a role, right, begin to kind of take on something like a belief, right?
Yeah,
about themselves,
right. Actors.
Right? Yeah.
What's the name of that? The kind of acting?
Yeah, like method acting. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
So you see that a little bit, right, in that kind of thing. Maybe controversially, you see that a bit in politics, right, where people people look at two photographs of political rallies and insist that one of them is larger than the other, right? And and it seems patently false that that picture B has more people than picture A. But if you tell yourself that enough, maybe that shapes your perception and cognition.
Okay, so what I thought you were talking about was the politicians themselves, that they start to believe that they are, because I feel like that's what we are. Like, I feel like if I woke up in the morning and I didn't know what a Jamin was, I would act wildly different than like this little microprocess, this instantaneous processing I do of like, what does Jamin like to eat? What are his favorite clothes? What is he into? What are his hobbies? And like, I can like load that process in quickly enough that I can wake up and be a Jamin. But you take away those things and like, probably I don't even like half the things that I like. I don't know.
Yeah, no, yeah, absolutely, right. Yeah. So the ways in which our lives are curated, right, is a really good example of this too, right? Which is that, like upon some introspective reflection, we can see that some of the things that we say, we like, we feel, we believe are things that we say, we like, we feel, we believe, which may or may not be really how we feel or think. But then sometimes the boundary gets fuzzy because we say it enough, and then like we.
Yeah, sure. I think I'm
right.
Jamin. Yeah, I don't have no idea what he is.
You think you like cornflakes for breakfast or whatever it is. So more recently I've been I guess worry is the wrong word. Like, I'm interested in these kinds of questions about like, what is a belief? What are there any belief adjacent states and traits that are maybe not really beliefs but are interestingly close? What are these interesting like in between phenomena? And this work, I think I do less as a psychologist, right? Like I don't collect data on it. But I like thinking about these things conceptually, right? Like looking at the different phenomena, trying to think through them clearly or as clearly as I can. So a philosopher and I, Eric Schutz-Gable, who actually does know what he's talking about, I persuaded him to help me collect a bunch of philosophers and persuade them to write essays about what they think beliefs are. So like there's a book coming out next year which collects like 15 of these essays about like theories of belief, and that's been really interesting. So
that's cool.
Yeah, and of course like I think about those things and I think about, okay, like what does that mean for my like pastoral ministry, right? And so on Tuesday, so we've been going through the Nicene Creed all year because it's like the 1700th anniversary of the Nicene Creed, and we're ending with a reflection on what it means to say we or I believe in such and such a thing, and so some of this research will come to bear in these conversations with my congregation, with my parishioners, about this. Yeah, like what are the different senses in which we use the word believe in religion, and my hope, I guess, is that it makes people a bit more reflective about the beliefs they hold and don't hold, or maybe the beliefs that they hold inconsistently or more or less strongly. And also, like, I think I hope to encourage a kind of generosity about the kind of diversity of what believing entails, right? That for some people, believing looks like this. That believing in God is more or less the same as believing that there's milk in the fridge or whatever. But for other people, right, it's a very different kind of experience, and I think that's okay. And I like so some of this work has come to bear in the which is kind of unexpected because all else being equal, like my parishioners are not particularly interested in my academic work. I like not my wife is barely interested in my academic work. So like it's not that surprising that they're not interested in my academic work. But like I think there have been ways in which it has come to kind of infect the work I do here.
Yes, well, it goes back to like you can't necessarily help what you're compelled by for whatever reason, and thank God we're not all compelled by the same thing. So like all of this like fascinating stuff about like what is a belief and what is knowledge and what's the difference between milk in the fridge and believing in God and all that stuff. And then I feel like a lot of people, at least from my past, are like, I believe it. Like, who cares? Like I believe it, and that's good enough for me. Like after all that work, but like thank God we're not all on the same level for every topic that there is. So it seems really cool to me.
Yeah. I mean, like, I think when I'm feeling more optimistic, I think that at least like some people appreciate the kind of, you know, slightly abstruse, like esoteric stuff that comes from the pulpit sometimes. But okay, you know, like, but people do tell me that sometimes my sermons give them headaches, and like I don't know if it's strictly speaking a criticism, but it's at least slightly a criticism. But I hope that it's a good kind of headache, I think.
Well, and it seems like the same thing that you were saying before about like within our particular denomination or within our belief system, like we need a couple agitators who are like part of the group who are pushing us to do something other than just purely use this worldview as a lubricant for moving through life without contradiction. So
no, that's right. I hope that this is editable in some kind of sensible way for you.
Absolutely.
I'm sorry about how meandering it's been.
It was all extremely fascinating, and I'll still hold out hope for a round 2 after I edit this all, maybe sometime in the future, because we've got a lot more that we could talk about. You've changed my world.
All right. See you next time.
Thank you all once again for joining me. As a few reminders, if you heard anything in the episode that you like, there's probably a link to it in the description. If you're watching on video, there's also an audio-only podcast version. If you're the kind of person who's willing to give 5-star reviews, I'm the kind of person who genuinely appreciates it. But even more than that, I'm the kind of person who appreciates it when my distant cousins are honest and kind and generous with each other. Be well. I'm rooting for you. And you should too.